Good morning, everyone. Just give everybody 1 or 2 more minutes to join. Okay, we'll get started and people can trickle in as they will. So welcome everybody to the first public meeting as part of the 3 Mile Lake Causation Study consultation process. Thanks so much for joining us virtually today. We appreciate your willingness to participate in the electronic format of this meeting. My name is Jackie Evans, and I am the Planning, Policy, and Programs Coordinator at the district. I would like to mention before we get too far into the meeting that it is being recorded and it will be made available on the 3 Mile Lake Causation Study page on our Engage Muskoka website. So if you're not comfortable participating in the meeting, given that it is being recorded, just feel free to keep your camera and microphone off and just listen and watch, and feel free to follow up with me after the meeting with your input or comments. Causation studies are initiated in accordance with the Muskoka official plan when a lake experiences one of 3 water quality indicators, one being the occurrence of a blue-green algae bloom. 3 Mile Lake was chosen for this study based on its history of algae blooms, having experienced a number of blooms over the past several years. There are many other lakes that have experienced blooms, so 3 Mile was also chosen based on the fact that the lake has higher development potential, and the Lake Association has been highly engaged and has invested considerable resources in a variety of water quality initiatives to date. There has also been a notable amount of research done to date on the lake, which this study will build on. There are 4 other causation studies happening concurrently with the 3 Mile Lake study, and so studies will be unique to each lake, but we also have an opportunity to look at factors affecting water quality on a watershed-wide basis. For each causation study, a consulting team was selected, which includes individuals with expertise in public engagement and in lake science. Together, this team will be studying 3 Mile Lake and liaising with stakeholders to assist in determining why algae blooms have been occurring. Our project team is really looking forward to the upcoming work on this study. And of course, we look forward to hearing from all of you as well. Rebecca, or Jessica, maybe we could start sharing the presentation now. Great, thank you. And I'll just ask you if you can go to the second slide, please. Thank you so much. I'd just like to take a few minutes to introduce the other members of the project team. Dr. Christopher Hadley, PhD of Hutchinson Environmental Sciences, has 15 years of experience as an aquatic scientist and 7 years as an environmental consultant. His PhD included research on over 50 lakes in the Muskoka-Haliburton region to assess the impact of recent stressors, including climate and land use change. As a consultant, Chris has worked on water quality issues across Canada, including extensive experience assessing the trophic status of lakes and managing water quality issues, including cyanobacterial blooms. His recent consulting experience includes a review of the factors controlling cyanobacterial blooms in Chamcook Lake, New Brunswick, with Dr. Alan Curry, and the development and application of a framework for causation studies for the District of Muskoka as part of the Peninsula Lake Causation Study Pilot Program. Wilbur is a planner with EcoView Consulting based out of Peterborough. With over 20 years of experience, Francis has worked on a number of large and small scale consultation projects. Francis has experience working in both the private and nonprofit sectors, including contracts with the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association. Jessica Ray Reed is a junior planner with EcoView Consulting. She has experience working with both municipal and private sector clients. She has experience assisting with public open houses and has worked extensively on community engagement related to official plan and zoning bylaw amendments. Colleagues of mine at the district who will be involved in the study and who are on the call today include Christy Doyle, the Director of Environmental and Watershed Programs, and Rebecca Willison, the watershed planning technician. Last but certainly not least, we'll be relying on the participation of stakeholders such as yourselves, members of the Lake Association, those who live or work on or near the lake, those who use the lake for recreational purposes, and others who have important knowledge that is vital to our current and historical understanding of the lake. We also appreciate the participation of our area municipal colleagues, particularly Bryce Sharp, Manager of Planning at the Township of Muskoka Lakes. Next slide, please, Jessica. Thanks so much. So in terms of project roles, I'll be your first point of contact for yourselves and other members of the public who are looking for information about the study or who have data or input or comments to contribute. We'll share a slide at the end of the presentation with my contact information, but after today, if you have any other information you'd like to share or any questions that you have that weren't answered or that come to you afterwards, I invite you to contact me directly, and I'll be sure to pass along your inquiry to the appropriate project team member. Francis Wilbur from EcoView will be leading the public consultation activities related to the study, including today's meeting, and Chris Hadley from Hutchinson Environmental Sciences will be leading the scientific process and technical aspects of the study. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Francis.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and welcome everybody to our first meeting for the 3 Mile Lake Causation Study. I just wanted to go over some housekeeping around the meeting that we're having today. So throughout the meeting today, the chat function will be monitored. So if you've got any questions, we suggest that maybe you put the questions in the chat and we'll try and get to them throughout the presentation. If we don't get to them throughout the presentation, we will get to them at the end. We've got a special Q&A section at the end of the presentation where we can unmute people and let them ask the questions there. But if you had questions throughout, feel free to put them in the chat and we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand at the bottom of your screen there, and we can call on you and unmute you to ask those questions throughout. Okay, and Rebecca was just going to launch a poll for us so that we sort of get an understanding of where you're all from and what brought you to this meeting today. So if you are able to vote, we've got a couple options here. So are you a year-round resident on 3 Mile Lake, a seasonal resident on 3 Mile Lake, owner of a business located on or around 3 Mile Lake, or I don't live on 3 Mile Lake, but I'm interested in this study? You had a chance to vote on those. It looks like, as they're just coming in, quite a few seasonal residents today on 3 Mile Lake, a couple year-round residents, and a couple people who are interested in the study but don't live on 3 Mile Lake. So that's great. Thank you for that. That gives us an idea of who's on the call. And looks like we got somebody building a residence on 3 Mile Lake. Sure, it's hard to do right now in the middle of the pandemic, but okay, so if we could close the poll and move on to the next slide, that would be great. Oh. Okay, here we go. So today's roadmap for the presentation. So like I said, we'll have questions at the end of the presentation, and any questions that we can't answer during this presentation, we will record and make sure that we get an answer to you following the presentation. If you're not watching this live today, you can email any questions that you have to Jackie, and she will get them out to the consulting team. And I just want to say that we have about an hour and a half planned for this meeting. We probably won't need all of that, but if we do, we've got an hour and a half planned for the meeting. And if there are things that we don't get to during the meeting, again, Jackie is available after the meeting, as is the consulting team, to answer any additional questions that you have. So we will do a background on causation studies. We'll talk about 3 Mile Lake specifically, and then we'll go through the next steps for this project. Most importantly, we want to hear from you, and we hope to have the question and answer where you are able to participate at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm wondering if we can unmute Susan Walker, who is a past president of the 3 Mile Lake Association, and she was just going to give us a brief introduction to 3 Mile Lake Association. So I just need to find Susan Walker on. Here we go. And I'm trying to unmute. There we go. Susan, are you able to?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine. So if you wanted to just introduce yourself and 3 Mile Lake Association, that would be great.
Right. Well, I think you kind of introduced me, but I'm past president. Been on the association since 2014. And there has been a 3 Mile Lake Association since the 1970s, but after the significant algae bloom in 2005, the association really became very active. It was incorporated in 2006. So there's just over 600 properties on the lake, and our membership fluctuates, but we ended 2020 with 268 members. We communicate with our members regularly through emails, our website, quarterly newsletters. And in the past year, we launched a Facebook page, which has become very popular. We also in 2020 produced a new lake plan, which contains recommendations to the Township of Muskoka Lakes, which are specific to our lake. Since we became the poster child for blue-green algae, we've learned a great deal about our lake and the delicate balance between development, lake stewardship, and climate change. And as I pointed out earlier, there have been several studies done on the lake. And unfortunately, the most comprehensive study has never been published, although Dr. Patterson has shared some of his findings with us. In August of 2019, we circulated a survey to all property owners, and 86% responded that hazardous algae blooms are the issue of most concern to them. And I guess if you needed any contact information, it's all on our website for all of our directors on the association. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's really helpful, and that provides a lot of background for those of us on the call who haven't been on 3 Mile Lake for a long time. And I'm sure, Susan, we will be in touch with you, and the data that you've got will be invaluable to how we're proceeding with the study. So I will go on to get into the bulk of the study, and like I said, if you've got a question, please put it in chat. So Jess, do you want to move on to the next slide? So I just want to go over quickly what is a causation study. And I know that there'll probably be a number of people on the call that this is not new information to you, but we want to make sure that we are including people in this process that maybe haven't been involved in some of the studies that have taken place in the past. So a causation study is, the process is outlined, as Jackie said, in the official plan, but we want to make sure that everybody understands it's an evolving process that is particular for each lake. So we do adjust as we go. Generally, causation studies will determine the causes of the lake's vulnerability, and there may be more than one contributing cause. So there's what we call relative factors, and Chris will explain a little bit more as we get into the specifics of 3 Mile Lake. But we do want to say that each lake is different, but we do take a watershed approach when we're looking at causation studies. There are, as Jackie said, 5 of these causation studies taking place at the same time. And so by having the project teams involved in all 5, we then take a sort of broader conclusions and recommendations that could be applied to a watershed-wide basis. A causation study will inform future policy and programs. A causation study doesn't create or implement policy, but it can inform future municipal policy updates. And a causation study does not create programs at the municipality, but does inform future programs at the municipality. Jess, do you want to go on to the next slide, please? So in terms of the causation study process, the process for each lake is outlined in the official plan. And so although each lake will be different, we do follow a process in order to complete the causation study. And I think, like I said, Chris will get into sort of the more technical details as we're going through this presentation. But basically, a causation study will look at assessing the existing water quality conditions. We'll look at historic water quality and our algal abundances. So a lot of the information that Susan talked about that you already have done on the lake will really inform a lot of the causation study as we move forward. So we do model and quantity the source of nutrients, determine if water quality is deteriorating or changing, and attributing specific causes or contributing factors to the water quality indicators. And as I said, Chris, who I'm going to hand it over to now, will get into the more specifics of this causation study for 3 Mile Lake. So Chris, do you want to take it away and just go to the next slide?
Thank you, Francis. So it was touched on a little bit by Jackie at the beginning, but there are 3 primary criteria that are determined, that are used to determine in the official plan whether or not a lake is considered vulnerable. High long-term phosphorus levels being over 20 micrograms per liter, an increasing trend in phosphorus levels over time, or in the case of 3 Mile Lake, their active trigger, a confirmed blue-green algal bloom, as Susan pointed out. And I just wanted to say before I dive too far in, that Susan and the 3 Mile Lake Association sent Jackie a letter ahead of this meeting with a lot of information in it, which I did receive, just so that the Lake Association knows I did receive that and I have looked at it. And it was very helpful, so thank you for that. As Susan was saying, and I think as most people on this call probably know, 3 Mile poster child was a good way to put it, has been a long-term study lake for the environmental changes that we're seeing throughout Ontario and beyond, in terms of increased algal bloom frequencies and severities, because it had the major algal bloom in 2005 and then has bloomed almost every single year since 2012. Why the factors are important that are being used for algal lakes? High phosphorus levels, obviously, because phosphorus is the primary limiting nutrient for biological growth in most lakes. Nitrogen can be a limiting factor in some lakes, but in the vast majority of lakes, it's phosphorus. Phosphorus is more readily controllable through septic system controls, runoff controls, those sorts of things. Nitrogen is more tricky to manage. And so being able to control phosphorus obviously makes it a management priority. And then blue-green algal blooms, why is that an important factor? Obviously, there's the nuisance factor, surface scums, recreational use loss, but of course, some of these cyanobacterial blooms can be quite toxic as well to our pets, to agricultural cattle and so forth, and to humans to a lesser degree. It's less severe harm, but it's still potentially quite dangerous, especially to like children and stuff like that. So obviously a great deal of concern around algal blooms in the area. So vulnerable lakes are eligible for causation studies, and that's obviously what we're here to talk about today. Next slide, please. So working with Neil Hutchinson, I developed a framework for causation studies as part of the Peninsula Lake pilot program in 2019, which was completed in 2020. That framework uses what we call the weight of evidence approach, which is trying to look at as many factors as there are data for, basically. So that would be climate, that would be history of algae blooms, that would be water quality data from the lake from the watershed, wherever we can find data. Obviously, we're in a data-rich scenario here, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And basically taking all of those bits of data and trying to put them together to determine what the most likely cause of algal blooms would be. Next slide, please. So this is just an outline map of roughly what that looks like. And this was the framework that we built, and the actual individual lines of evidence are in a table that I didn't present here because it gets a little bit difficult to manage. But essentially at the top, what you can see in the blue, green, and orange is the data that we are trying to pull together as what we call our lines of evidence. So the frequency, magnitude, and species of algal blooms tell us a lot about what might be going on in the lake. The water chemistry data, general chemistry, nutrients, toxins, and other data. This is just what I've listed on the pictograph here. And then climate history, temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, all of these things are known from literature studies and scientific reviews to contribute to algal blooms. This is not a comprehensive list of everything, it's just what fits on the picture. Essentially, we then take the data that we have available, supplement it where we can with additional field data collection, identify gaps in that data that might become recommendations for further studies. We analyze what data we can under the scope of the project as much as possible, and we're looking for changes over time. We're looking for changes, step changes associated with algal blooms. We're looking for basically a cause-effect relationship between the algal bloom history and the water chemistry data that we have available. Next slide. In 3 Mile Lake's case, the review of existing water quality monitoring data will be a large undertaking. There is a lot of data available. There's a lot of historical data and reports that have been done, and Susan provided a good summary of some of those. Some of them, like Andrew's work at the Dorset Environmental Science Center, I was familiar with. He was my PhD supervisor, and I worked on 3 Mile Lake when I did my PhD in 2007 and 2008. Some of them, like the tributary sampling, I was not aware of. So it's good to know that there are tributary samples. That was one of the things that I had flagged for some of these lakes as data we might not have that we might want. So it's good to know that there is tributary sampling out there. So we're going to look at all the water quality data sampling and data collection that's been done. We're going to do a little bit of additional fall sampling focused probably, we haven't determined this for sure, but right now I'm looking at whether or not we can focus some of it on the main basin on anoxic conditions, because while there is good evidence of anoxia in the Hamels Bay Basin, we haven't looked at. I'm not sure that the main basin has had the same level of research done, but again, I'm preliminary stages of looking through this. And then we're going to incorporate obviously the contributions of the stakeholders and as I mentioned, look at the potential for future sampling. Next slide. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the 3 Mile Lake is unique in that it is 2 distinct basins, Hamels Bay and the main basin, behave very differently. They have different physical characteristics. There's several other bays as well. And I'm noticing that the Lake Partner Program has been collecting more data on those basins, which is going to be very helpful. Obviously, the history of blooms we've already mentioned. There has been some more recent paleolimnological reconstructions by a colleague of mine that I recently published a paper with, Dr. Liz Favat, and she's collected some cores on 3 Mile Lake and done some down core analysis, which are interesting. So that will be incorporated as part of our review as well. There's so much data on this. I think focusing on some of the more recent and novel research will be interesting, assuming that it's relevant to the causation study. Next slide. So this is just a brief overview of the lake. The sites that are marked on there with the stars are just the District of Muskoka sites. So there are additionally five sites that we'll be looking at from the Lake Partner Program. I believe those 5 sites from the Lake Partner Program, based on my preliminary looks at some of the background, align with Dr. Patterson's work in the 3-year study starting in after the 2005 bloom. And then there's tributary sites that are associated with both the lake associations monitoring and with the larger program that was done by the MECP. So we'll be looking at all of those sites. So it just highlights how well studied the lake is. There's quite a large number of monitoring sites compared to some of the other lakes that are part of the causation study process. So it'll be interesting to tackle this from a wealth of data perspective. Usually we're struggling to find data, but I think in this case, we're going to have a lot. Next slide. Thank you. Possible causes of high P levels that we'll be considering or that may be contributing. Internal loading from sediments is pretty well established as an issue in Hamels Bay. In the main basin, like I said, there's not the same level of recorded anoxia. However, some of that sampling is done in August. So we're hoping to get out a little bit later in the season to see whether or not late anoxia develops. And if it doesn't, that's fine. But we want to, that's one of the things that we want to look at. The main basin is a little bit shallower and therefore not as likely to go anoxic. Overland runoff from the catchment, about I believe it's 8 to 10% agriculture in 3 Mile Bay, or sorry, in the 3 Mile watershed in terms of land use, which is not typical for Muskoka. Not that agriculture is the only overland runoff that is a concern, but so we'll be looking at potential for sources from overland runoff. Like I said earlier, we have input data from some of this from the upstream water bodies and the water courses coming into the lake that we can look at. Septics and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if there are any previous septic reports. An actual complete audit of septic systems is obviously outside of what we can do as part of this study, but it could potentially be, if we believe it to be an issue, a recommendation that comes out of the study. And other natural occurring sources from geology and geography are obviously a factor as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the deep water oxygen angle on Hamels Bay has been studied before. So this is just an overview from a Sturgeon Bay example of how that works. And that is the deep basins of these, excuse me, the deep basins of these lakes can often lose oxygen as a result of stratified water columns. So the water at the surface warms up and then does not mix because of it being warmer than the cold water below. And when it doesn't mix, that means oxygen from the air, from the surface, does not mix to the deep water. And the deep water gradually loses oxygen as bacteria breaks down organic matter near the sediment surface. And that results in what we call anoxia. So that's a lack of oxygen at the sediment surface. And the chemical properties of the sediment that I won't go into in detail, that makes or that results in the release of phosphorus from the sediment, and sometimes in massive quantities, because sediment is a huge sink for phosphorus in lake basins. And you can see a little bit of that here. So the blue line is dissolved oxygen in the top right, and it goes to 0 in around July. And as a result, you see the graph below that, phosphorus spikes starting in July. And as a result of that, you can see the teal in the graph on the bottom left, which is cyanobacterial concentration. You get cyanobacterial dominance because the cyanobacteria can take advantage of that phosphorus in the deep water because they're able to control where they sit in the water column. They can go down to the lower water, take up the phosphorus, and then bloom. Whereas other algae are not as good at that strategy. Next slide.
And I think
So I'll
this
turn
is
it
where
back. Yeah, I'll
take
turn it
over,
back
yeah.
over to Frances
Yeah.
at this point. So that was
Yeah.
just a brief overview of some of the things that we're looking at, and she will go over the next steps of the causation study process. And if you guys have any questions on the technical aspects, I'll be happy to answer them at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So I'll just go through quickly. I'll do this fairly quickly, and because I think probably most of us already know most of this information. So what can you expect from this causation study? Well, as Chris said, we're looking at all the available scientific data, and I understand for this lake, there's lots to look over. You can expect to have conclusions and recommendations that are defensible based on that review of all of the scientific data that we've gone through. Change is future forward. So we all have a role to play in this causation study. And we'll talk about our roles in a minute. And I just wanted to go over again what a causation study is not. So it's not an original research project. It's not a site-by-site review of development on the lake. And it's not all encompassing, I'm sorry. So there'll be questions at the end of the causation study, as Chris sort of went over, that maybe we'll have some recommendations for the district on further studies, depending on what we find throughout the project. Next slide. So what can you expect from the causation study? The conclusions of the study will both be at a micro and a macro level, specific to 3 Mile Lake or to the entire watershed. As we've said, we are doing 5 of these at the same time, and so there'll be recommendations across for each citizen of 3 Mile Lake, for the district, and for the wider community as a whole. Next slide, Jeff. So in terms of this 3 Mile Lake, so far we have, obviously, the RFP was issued and awarded to Hutchinson and to EcoView. We've had a startup meeting where we've met with the district, where we've started to collect that data. And as Chris said, he's already started to review some of the data that's been provided. So we've confirmed our roles and the project and planned the consultation process. So we've started to receive the data and Chris has started to review it. We've identified some of the past studies and the existing data and started to identify some of the initial gaps in the data. Next slide. So in terms of the proposed project timeline for this project, today is our first public meeting and we're going to be launching a survey this week, and that survey will be available for people to share information and share any data that they've got that we didn't already touch on. There'll be opportunity to provide some other background information on that data. So we'll spend the spring, summer, and this fall gathering the data and reviewing all of that data. We expect to have a second public meeting in the fall of 2021 and a draft report available in early 2022. And the final report would go to the District Community and Planning Services Committee in mid-2022. Next slide. So how can you help? By attending this meeting, that's very helpful because we need your local knowledge of your lake. The terms of reference for this project is continually being updated. It's a framework that we use, but it's evolving as we learn. And as we start to review the data, we will be updating that terms of reference. Specifically, the kind of data that we're looking for, and Chris can explain in more detail if you've got specific questions about that kind of information. So specifically, we're going to be looking for historic weather patterns related to the blooms, water quality sampling data or lake-specific studies, information on point sources of nutrients, historical observations on water quality changes, observations on water patterns, lake plans. And I did note that the lake plan was done in 2020 and we do have copies of that, and any photos that you've got. So the survey is a good place to share that information. And if you're not able to share it through the survey directly with Jackie, is also a great place to share that information. And I just noticed that we did have a question in the chat box about whether the pandemic is changing the timelines. We don't anticipate that it will change the timelines. I mean, everything is evolving all the time, but we can do most of this data without while still staying within the restrictions that have been outlined by the provincial government. And we plan to continue on with the virtual public meetings. If the regulations have changed by the fall, then we might have an in-person meeting. We'll sort of adjust, but overall, the timelines for the project shouldn't be impacted by the current situation. Next slide. So what is the best way to share my data? Well, we've got a question and answer period at the end of this presentation, and we're happy to hear what kind of data you've got. We're launching the survey in the next week or so, where that's a great opportunity to share data. Jackie also is going to be able to receive any data that you've got, and we'll forward it on to the most, the best person for that data. We also have engaged Muskoka, and if you are interested, you can subscribe to project updates there, and that will engage Muskoka is the way that we'll be communicating a lot of this kind of stuff with as the project progresses. So one more slide. And I think Jackie will take it from here on the best way to communicate with the district, as they're going to receive all the information and then disseminate it as appropriate.
Sure, thanks, Francis. Yeah, so as Francis said, Engage Muskoka is a great place to go for all of the information on the study and for different ways you can get in touch with us. So it's engagemuskoka.ca, as we have on the screen here. You want to click on the project that's called Protecting Muskoka's Vulnerable Lakes Causation Studies, and then scroll down on that page and you'll see 3 Mile Lake listed, and that will take you right to the 3 Mile specific page. On this page, we'll be posting any updates. So, we'll be sharing the terms of reference. We'll be posting the survey when it's available, public meeting dates, all of that kind of stuff. So it has on Engage, there's a spot in the top right-hand corner where you can actually subscribe to updates if you haven't already. Whenever we post an update to the Engage page, we'd also just send out a quick email to anybody who has subscribed, just letting them know that an update has been posted, so you'll know to come back and check the page. I think I just saw a question in the chat. Will the presentation be posted? And yes, it will. We'll post the recording of this presentation on the Engage page within a couple days. Also, don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly anytime. My email's on the screen here, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions that you have about the study at any time.
Great, thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is just, Jess is going to stop sharing her presentation and we'll sort of go to a gallery view. And so if you've got questions, I'd encourage you to put them in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute whoever would like to be unmuted for that. So the first question, I think we answered the ones that came up during the chat. We do have a suggestion down the road that the AGM for 3 Mile invite a speaker to provide an update, and that, certainly if the 3 Mile Association wanted to be in touch with Jackie about that, Jackie could talk about that. So are there any questions that we want to start with? You can raise your hand or in the chat box. No questions.
We were very thorough.
Yeah. Jim, it looks like maybe.
Yeah, Jim Prince here. I'm from, I have a cottage. I'm a board of directors member on a cottage association in Haliburton. And we've had blue-green algae events during 2020, and we're in the process of doing much the same as you folks, a little behind. I have a couple questions about one of the topics that was mentioned. Do you currently have septic inspection data for 3 Mile Lake?
I don't know is the best answer I can give to that question. I haven't looked through all of the data. I don't know if there's septics to report. That's been done, so I honestly don't know yet.
Okay. Do you happen to know if any of the other causation studies had septic inspection data?
I think Chris, Jim, sorry, we're just kind of getting into them, so I'm not sure if Chris is going to be able to answer all those questions.
Okay.
But Chris, do you want to?
I don't know for sure. I was trying to remember if Peninsula Lake had one and see if I could quickly open some of the resources I had from that original study on my report. But yeah, without digging in and getting back to you, I can't say on this call, oh, here we've got septic inspections were done on 3 Mile Lake several years ago. Check with the association. So there you go in the chat. So if the Lake Association has that data, chances are they provided to me, and it's in the giant folder of data I have, and I just haven't seen it yet. And if it's not, I'll reach out to them and request it.
Okay, and then perhaps potentially an offer. We did a very extensive septic inspection program on Kinesis Lake in 2018 and 2019, and we're working with our municipality and classifying that information so we can understand what the impact may have been on the blue-green algae events. If you're interested in getting in touch with me, I could show you how we're trying to parse that data.
Interesting. It's a different lake, so it could be a very different situation, but it's
That's
good
it.
to know that.
Yeah.
Certainly we had many septic failures. They had never been inspected, and we feel that there's a close connection between cause and the number of septics that were malperforming.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I'm
Thank
sure
you very
there's
much.
people on the call from the association that might be interested in chatting with you. So if that's the case, maybe you can provide your contact details to Jackie, and so that if somebody is interested, we can share that information with them.
Certainly.
Thank you. Is there any other questions?
Yes, I would really like the association to revisit the septic tanks. I know for a fact that several cottages where I am have holding tanks. The discussion is they admit that the holding tanks are leaking. They have to have them pumped frequently. And there are several septic tanks that are very, very old. And I know that the association has done studies on this, but I would really like them to revisit, especially holding tanks and that type of thing. I know that that is a huge problem in Hamel Bay because I know the cottagers and the discussions that have been said.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful information. And so I'm sure there's people here, Susan in particular, from the Cottage Association that can take that information down. And again, if you wanted to share your information with Jackie, we can pass that on.
Thank you. I will. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Chris about the data, or anybody want to share any data that they've got that they'd like to? Like I said, there's lots of opportunity to share that information, but if there is anything in particular right now.
Just a comment, I'd like to say what a wonderful presentation that was. I didn't understand any of that, and Chris was able to describe it in lay terms, and nice job, Chris.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And yeah, this presentation will be recorded too, and I find that helpful if you don't have the scientific background to be able to go back and listen to it slowly if you want to. So. Okay, well, with that, Jackie, I guess that's it. No questions.
Okay, well, thanks, Francis. Thanks, Chris, for all your work today. And thank you, everybody, for attending and for your participation. As I said, don't hesitate to get in touch with me anytime. And please do visit the Engage page if you haven't already and subscribe. And we will keep everyone updated on the project progress through that page. Thanks so much, everybody, again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.